Washington didn't suddenly turn on Donald Trump overnight. At first, the shift was almost impossible to notice. A senator refusing to answer a question, a Republican spokesperson suddenly changing their tone during a television interview, cabinet officials speaking more carefully than usual. For weeks, the political pressure surrounding Donald Trump had been building quietly behind the scenes in Washington. But then, something changed. Because this time, the tension was no longer coming only from political opponents. It was starting to spread inside the system itself. And for many people watching closely inside Washington, that silence became impossible to ignore. In public, Trump still projected confidence. The rallies continued, the speeches continued, the headlines continued. But behind closed doors, Republican lawmakers were beginning to face a growing political reality that many of them had spent years trying to avoid. The legal pressure surrounding Trump was growing. The media scrutiny was intensifying, and new constitutional discussions that once sounded politically impossible were suddenly being mentioned again across television panels, newspapers, and political strategy meetings. Not because Washington had officially turned against Trump, but because, quietly, the people around him were beginning to calculate risk differently. And in American politics, that changes everything. Because Washington operates on one rule above all else: power survives only as long as people believe it can survive. And during some of the most politically tense weeks surrounding Donald Trump's presidency and legal battles, cracks inside that belief system were beginning to appear everywhere. Some Republicans started avoiding direct answers about Trump during interviews. Others suddenly shifted their language completely. Even longtime allies who had defended him aggressively in the past now appeared noticeably more cautious when discussing investigations, constitutional questions, or the growing legal pressure surrounding him. Then came something even more unusual: the silence. For brief moments, some of Trump's strongest political defenders simply stopped speaking publicly altogether. And in Washington, silence is rarely accidental. Because when powerful political figures stop defending someone publicly, it usually means one thing: they're waiting to see what happens next. And suddenly, questions that once belonged only to political speculation were starting to move into mainstream political conversation. Could Trump's legal pressure eventually become politically unsustainable? Would Republican leadership continue standing behind him if investigations escalated further? And perhaps most importantly, was Washington beginning to emotionally prepare itself for a political future beyond Donald Trump? Because behind the headlines, behind the speeches, and behind the nonstop political warfare on television, something inside Washington's atmosphere was beginning to change. And many people inside the political system could already feel it. For years, one of Donald Trump's greatest political advantages was simple. Republicans believed staying close to him was politically safer than opposing him. That calculation shaped Washington for nearly a decade. Even during investigations, even during impeachment battles, even during nonstop media controversy, most Republican lawmakers ultimately stayed aligned with Trump because his influence over the party remained enormous. But political loyalty inside Washington is rarely permanent, and by 2026, several pressures were beginning to collide all at once. The legal pressure surrounding Trump was growing more unpredictable. Courtroom battles were becoming more visible. Investigations continued generating headlines almost weekly. And across major media networks, constitutional questions that once seemed politically untouchable were quietly re-entering public discussion again. Not because Washington had reached a final conclusion, but because uncertainty itself had started spreading through the political system. And uncertainty is dangerous inside Washington. Because once politicians begin privately questioning whether a political figure can still protect the party long-term, the atmosphere changes fast. Some Republican strategists reportedly became increasingly worried about independent voters. Others feared that continuing legal escalation surrounding Trump could eventually damage Senate races, House races, and even state-level elections across the country. Meanwhile, Democrats and political commentators began openly revisiting discussions surrounding executive accountability, constitutional limits, and long-term institutional stability. And while many of those conversations remained highly speculative, their growing visibility mattered politically. Because Washington reacts not only to reality, but to momentum. And suddenly the momentum surrounding Trump no longer felt as stable as it once had. Television panels began sounding different. News anchors who once treated Trump's political dominance as untouchable started openly discussing possible fractures inside Republican leadership. Some political analysts even began comparing the atmosphere surrounding Washington to previous moments in American history, when political loyalty systems suddenly began weakening under public pressure. Then came another major shift. Several Republican lawmakers who had previously defended Trump aggressively started becoming noticeably more cautious during interviews. Some avoided answering direct questions altogether. Others shifted toward carefully neutral language, and a few simply stopped appearing publicly as often during major media cycles involving Trump's legal pressure. To most Americans, those moments may have looked insignificant, but inside Washington, political silence often speaks louder than public speeches. Because political systems are built on signals, and experienced lawmakers constantly watch each other for signs of movement, hesitation, fear, or strategic distancing. Then, something else started happening. More establishment Republican figures quietly began emphasizing words like stability, institutional trust, electability, and constitutional order during interviews and public appearances. At first, the shift sounded subtle, almost invisible, but over time, the language itself started revealing something important. Washington was beginning to emotionally prepare for uncertainty. And uncertainty creates fear inside political systems faster than almost anything else, especially when legal pressure, media scrutiny, public division, and electoral risk all begin colliding at the same time. Because at that point, politicians stop asking only one question: can this person survive? They begin asking a much more important one: can we survive with them? And inside Washington, that question changes everything. Meanwhile, Trump himself continued projecting confidence publicly. At rallies, he attacked political opponents aggressively, he dismissed investigations repeatedly, and he continued portraying the legal pressure surrounding him as politically motivated attacks designed to weaken his influence before future elections. His supporters largely remained loyal. Poll numbers inside key Republican voter groups often stayed remarkably resilient. And that complicated Washington's calculations even further. Because while establishment figures worried privately about institutional damage, millions of Republican voters still viewed Trump as the strongest political figure inside the party, which created a growing divide between the Republican political base and parts of the Republican political establishment itself. And historically, that kind of divide can become extremely dangerous for political systems trying to maintain internal unity, especially when pressure continues building from every direction at once. What made the situation surrounding Donald Trump so politically unusual was that the pressure wasn't coming from only one direction anymore. It was coming from everywhere at once. Legal pressure, media pressure, institutional pressure, electoral pressure, and perhaps most dangerously of all, psychological pressure inside Washington itself. Because over time, political systems don't collapse through one dramatic moment. They change through accumulated uncertainty. And by this stage, uncertainty had quietly spread through almost every level of Washington. Republican strategists worried about future elections. Senators worried about suburban voter backlash. Donors worried about long-term political instability. And establishment figures worried about something even larger: whether the Republican Party itself was becoming too politically dependent on one individual. That fear had existed privately inside parts of Washington for years. But now, under growing legal and political pressure, those concerns were becoming harder to ignore publicly, especially as media narratives surrounding Trump grew increasingly intense across both American and international coverage. Every court appearance became major national news. Every investigation created another wave of speculation. Every controversial statement triggered another cycle of political panic online. And inside Washington, lawmakers began realizing something uncomfortable. The atmosphere surrounding Trump was no longer behaving like a normal political controversy. It was starting to behave like a permanent national crisis cycle. And permanent crisis cycles exhaust political systems, especially systems built around elections, donor confidence, institutional trust, and public stability. Then came another important shift. Some Republicans who had once fully embraced Trump's political style started subtly repositioning themselves politically. Not openly against him, not directly distancing themselves, but carefully adjusting their language, adjusting their tone, adjusting how often they publicly appeared beside him. And in Washington, those small adjustments matter enormously, because political distancing rarely begins dramatically. It begins quietly, one interview at a time, one avoided question at a time, one carefully worded statement at a time, until eventually the atmosphere changes completely. At the same time, constitutional discussions surrounding executive power and presidential accountability were becoming more visible again across mainstream political debate. Legal analysts discussed possible scenarios constantly on television. Commentators debated how far presidential immunity should extend. Former officials gave interviews warning about institutional instability, and social media amplified every theory, every rumor, and every political fear almost instantly. The result was a Washington environment filled with tension, speculation, and emotional volatility. And emotionally volatile political systems often become unpredictable very quickly, especially when powerful institutions begin reacting emotionally instead of strategically. Meanwhile, Trump continued doing what had always made him politically powerful, dominating attention. Even under pressure, he remained the center of the national conversation almost constantly. His speeches still generated headlines worldwide. His rallies still attracted enormous audiences, and his ability to command media attention remained almost unmatched in modern American politics. But attention and stability are not always the same thing. And inside Washington, many political figures had started realizing that distinction more clearly than ever before. Because while Trump's political influence remained extremely strong among his supporters, the institutional confidence surrounding him appeared increasingly unstable behind the scenes. And once institutional confidence begins weakening inside political systems, fear spreads quickly. Not public fear, private fear. The kind that changes conversations behind closed doors. The kind that changes how senators answer reporters. The kind that changes how party leaders calculate political survival. And most Americans never fully see those moments happen in real time. They only notice the atmosphere afterward, once the silence has already started spreading. By this point, the atmosphere inside Washington no longer felt politically normal. The headlines were still moving at full speed. Cable news panels continued debating Trump almost nonstop. Social media remained flooded with arguments, reactions, investigations, and speculation every hour of the day. But underneath all the noise, something quieter was happening. And inside political systems, quiet changes are often the most dangerous ones. Because eventually, people inside Washington began noticing something unusual. Some of Trump's strongest defenders were no longer defending him with the same confidence as before. The shift wasn't dramatic at first. There was no single speech, no official announcement, no public revolt. Instead, the change happened gradually, through hesitation. One senator refusing to directly answer whether Trump's legal pressure was becoming politically damaging. Another Republican avoiding television appearances during major investigation cycles. Party figures suddenly redirecting interviews toward the future of the Republican Party instead of Trump himself. To the average viewer, those moments may have looked insignificant, but inside Washington, they were impossible to ignore. Because experienced political operatives understand one thing extremely well. Public loyalty only survives as long as private confidence survives first. And slowly, that private confidence appeared to be weakening. Then came the silence. For brief periods during some of the most politically intense news cycles surrounding Trump, several major Republican voices simply stopped commenting publicly altogether. No aggressive television appearances, no immediate social media defense, no coordinated media messaging, just caution. And caution inside Washington usually means one thing: people are recalculating risk. Meanwhile, legal pressure surrounding Trump continued dominating headlines across the country. Constitutional experts debated executive accountability constantly. Former officials warned about institutional instability. Media organizations analyzed every court development in real time. And across Washington, political strategists began quietly asking difficult questions that few people had wanted to confront openly before. What would happen if the pressure kept escalating? Could the Republican Party survive another prolonged constitutional crisis cycle? Would independent voters eventually begin pulling away permanently? And perhaps most importantly, how long could Washington continue operating inside nonstop political emergency mode? Because by this stage, many people inside the political system no longer viewed the situation as a temporary controversy. It was beginning to feel structural, something deeper, something heavier, almost like Washington itself had entered a prolonged state of political exhaustion. And political exhaustion changes behavior. Lawmakers become more cautious, institutions become more defensive, allies become quieter. Even media coverage starts shifting emotionally over time, not because everyone suddenly agrees, but because uncertainty slowly reshapes the atmosphere itself. Meanwhile, Trump continued publicly projecting strength. At rallies, he remained combative, confident, defiant. He attacked political opponents aggressively and continued insisting that investigations surrounding him were politically motivated attempts to weaken his influence. And for millions of supporters, that message still resonated powerfully. But inside Washington, another reality was beginning to emerge quietly behind closed doors. Many political figures were no longer asking whether Trump remained influential. That part was obvious. The new question was different. Could the system continue surviving the level of instability surrounding him long term? And once political systems begin asking questions like that, the atmosphere changes permanently. Because at that point, loyalty stops being emotional. It becomes strategic. And strategic loyalty is far more fragile, especially when pressure keeps building from every direction at once. Then something else started becoming visible. Some Republicans who had once appeared inseparable from Trump politically now started emphasizing institutional language more carefully during interviews. Words like stability, governance, constitutional process, moving forward. At first, the language sounded subtle, but over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. Washington wasn't publicly abandoning Trump, not yet. But emotionally, parts of the system appeared to be preparing for the possibility that one day they might have to. What made this moment inside Washington so politically significant was not simply the investigations surrounding Donald Trump. American politics has survived investigations before. It has survived scandals before. It has survived impeachment battles before. But what worried many people inside Washington was something deeper: the growing feeling that the country's political institutions were slowly losing the ability to calm themselves down. Because over time, the Trump era transformed American politics into something far more emotionally intense than traditional partisan conflict. Every legal case became a national event. Every speech became a political emergency. Every investigation triggered another cycle of outrage, fear, speculation, and media warfare across the country. And eventually, political systems began absorbing that emotional pressure internally. That was the atmosphere Washington had quietly entered, an atmosphere where every institution suddenly felt fragile, where every election felt existential, where every constitutional debate felt historic, and where political loyalty itself began changing shape under pressure. For years, Trump's political movement had operated on one powerful emotional force: certainty. His supporters viewed him as someone willing to fight against institutions that many Americans no longer trusted. That certainty became one of the strongest political identities in modern American history. But inside Washington, certainty was beginning to disappear. And when certainty disappears inside political systems, people begin preparing for instability. That doesn't always happen publicly. In fact, most political repositioning happens quietly, behind closed doors, during private meetings, through cautious conversations between lawmakers, donors, strategists, media executives, and institutional figures trying to predict what comes next. And by this point, many people inside Washington appeared to be asking the same question privately. What happens if the political pressure surrounding Trump continues growing faster than the system can manage? Because the danger wasn't simply Trump himself. The danger was the atmosphere surrounding him. An atmosphere where every new investigation intensified national division, where every media cycle deepened political distrust, where every institutional reaction immediately became part of another national political war. And over time, that kind of environment changes how political systems behave. It creates fear, not necessarily fear of one individual, but fear of instability itself. And once institutions begin prioritizing stability over loyalty, political dynamics can shift extremely quickly. That's why the silence inside Washington mattered so much, because silence inside powerful political systems often signals something larger happening underneath the surface. Not necessarily collapse, not necessarily conspiracy, but recalculation. Careful political recalculation. And in Washington, recalculation usually begins long before the public fully notices it. Meanwhile, Trump himself remained one of the most influential political figures in the country. His support base remained deeply loyal. His ability to dominate national attention remained almost unmatched. And despite the growing legal and institutional pressure surrounding him, millions of Americans still viewed him as the central force shaping the future direction of the Republican Party, which meant Washington faced a political reality with no easy solution. Because distancing from Trump carried enormous risks, but remaining permanently tied to nonstop political crisis cycles carried risks too. And somewhere inside that tension, the atmosphere in Washington began changing quietly. Not through one dramatic event, not through one Senate vote, not through one speech, but through accumulation. Pressure accumulating, fear accumulating, silence accumulating, until eventually the political system itself started behaving differently. And perhaps that was the most important shift of all. Because political systems rarely reveal their turning points immediately. Sometimes, you only recognize the turning point after the atmosphere has already changed. Thank you for watching USA News Now. I'm Daniel Mercer.